cambia todo, cambia, cambia todo, cambia, cambia todo, cambia, cambia todo, cambia. Cambia el sol en su carrera cuando la noche subsiste. Cambia la planta y se viste de verde la primavera. Cambia el pelaje la fiera. Cambia el caballo el anciano. Cambia todo como cambia. Que yo cambié no es extraño. Pero no cambia mi amor por más lejos que me encuentre. Recuerdo el dolor de mi pueblo y de mi gente. Y lo que cambió ayer tendrá que cambiar mañana. Así como cambio yo en estas tierras lejanas. Cambia todo, cambia. Cambia todo, cambia. Cambia todo, cambia. Cambia todo, cambia. Gracias.
Bravo. Muchísimas gracias. Okay, so I will now hand in to Rafael.
Thank you very much, Rafaela, for this beautiful presentation and for opening our session in this lively manner. That was very nice. Thank you. And hello and welcome, everyone. It is a great pleasure to introduce Professor Cushman. Alan Cushman, Cherokee Nation citizen, is Dean's Professor of Civic Sustainability and Associate Dean of Academic Affairs, Diversity and Inclusion in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities at Northeastern University. In today's session, Professor Alan Cushman will be discussing her article, Translingual and Decolonial Approaches to Meaning Making, published in College English, January 2016. In this article, Cushman defines three aspects of translingual approaches to composition and rhetoric that can potentially involve scholars and students in meaning making that attempts to level linguistic and knowledge hierarchies. Cushman argues that epistemic delinking and border thinking can forward the decolonial possibilities of translingual approaches to writing and research. Professor Alan Cushman, thank you for accepting our invitation to join us today. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you all so much for having me here today. We're meeting today in a context that is highly fraught, obviously, with many inequities in this world, and much work for all of us to do where we can and the ways that we can. When I penned that article in 2016, my hope was really to set a set of aspirations for myself and for others doing the work of translingual pedagogy, translingual theory building, and to bridge it really with decoloniality. Decoloniality strikes me as one of the best possibilities for us to revalue various languages, revalue various knowledges, begin to understand how we can work together to create the equitable and pluriversal world that we seek. I would be remiss to point out that I today am standing on the lands of the Wampanoag, traditionally the Wampanoag people in Boston, as I speak to you today. And I would also like to thank Dr. McConey for organizing this, Magda for helping us administer this, it's wonderful, and Joey for getting us all together and bringing us together to think through what a praxis of translingualism might actually look like. And for me, that has been my goal for the last years since publishing this. I'd like to share just a few slides with you, if I may, to talk through what I've been working on as I try to realize some of the visions and the tenets of paradigm shifting that I was asking for in that particular article, and trying to give you a sense of how it is that I've been putting into practice, or at least what I hope is in practice, the translingual approach and the decolonial approach brought together to allow all of us to share in languages and help peoples persevere, and to also promote the preservation of languages as well. And so let me go ahead and share my screen, if I may, if this works. I'm hoping you all can see that. It's a live show, but when we practice this, that is to say, I'm not going to go much further than what you see here. Can you all read that though? I'm getting a thumbs up. Okay, terrific. And so what I'd like to do today is just give you a sense of how it is that I've been building with this wonderful team of colleagues here at Northeastern, with linguists around the country, with archivists, and with particularly the Cherokee Nation and representatives from the three nations of the Cherokee people: the East Carolina Band of Cherokee Indians, the Untitled Band of Cherokee Indians, and of course my own nation, the Cherokee Nation in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And really what we're hoping for is a way to create a nexus, a mutually sustaining relationship between language perseverance and language preservation. And so when we thought about how it is that we might begin to enact a collective creation of knowledge about language that allows many of us to move back and forth between language learning and language analysis and understanding and analyzing various themes or ideas within language, and thinking about the ways in which we might hold more carefully and more openly the archival materials that we have that are based on native languages. My hope was to establish, and this I formulated with my good colleague at Michigan State University, Gordon Henry, who's a White Earth Chippewa and Anishinaabemowin person at Michigan State University. And we went to our peoples and we said, what would such a place online look like that would allow us to practice the language in intergenerational groups around archival materials that we often don't have access to? And so we really set about thinking through what an interface might look like at that time with two different language families. And we proposed the Digital Archive of American Indian Language Perseverance and Preservation. And we emphasize the perseverance there because we really want our endangered languages to continue on, but they face many challenges. Many of them are endangered. In my own nation, we've lost several language speakers who were language keepers for us and national living treasures. And it's been very, very difficult for us to see this whole bridge generation basically pass away and take their language knowledge with us. And they haven't, their kids, understandably, because they're growing up in English only contexts and in a state that of Oklahoma that has been pretty rigid about English only standards and practices. Well, the long and the short of it is that we're more endangered than we would wish to be in the Cherokee language. That being said, we wanted to think through how it is that we could rebuild from top to bottom every single step of the imperial legacy of archive building and the fragmented and piecemeal approaches to language revitalization that have been going on for some time that don't see languaging as part of the four main arts, reading, writing, speaking, and listening together, but tend to focus, as we might in our disciplines, on various aspects of this. And how do we begin to bring together everybody in ways that allows us to do this good work of building language materials together? And so you'll see in the background here, kind of the archive that was desired by individuals from both my nation and Gordon Henry's nation, and what it would do and how it would look. And basically it would hold on the left-hand side or on one side of the window, one of these archival pieces. But this archival piece for us, for the Cherokee right now, this is the only one that we've piloted so far here at Northeastern, since I've joined Northeastern in 2015. For the Cherokee language, basically we've brought in archival materials from our partner on our advisory board, the Beinecke Rare Manuscript and Library, Rare Book and Manuscript Archive at Yale University, which houses the Kilpatrick manuscripts. And here you see one of the most beautifully written Kilpatrick manuscript. And the idea is that we would be able to highlight a word and be able to look very deeply into what makes that word work, so that we recuperate some of these suppressed epistemologies along the way, from how it sounds to how it's how we break it apart into syllables to begin to understand how it works, and then basically to give a free translation of that. The free translations, of course, have been donated by most of our tribal members who are part of our advisory board, and some tribal community members as well. But what also is lovely here is the deep linguistic information that our linguists have offered us in this collaboration. And that includes very, very close work with the morphemic parsing. And we've built on the back end, what you don't see here is a lexical data set that helps, will eventually help feed all of the information that our users are able to glean about a particular word. And we've begun mocking some of that up. And if there's time at the end of this, I'd love to show you what my students, Naomi Trevino, as well as Taylor Sneed and Aparna Dutta have created for us. It's absolutely beautiful. They're linguists here at Northeastern and computational linguistic undergrads who have been working diligently behind the scenes to help us build this architecture and this interface. But this would be lovely because it would allow scholars as well as students as well as language learners to begin to select the words that are in these documents and learn more about them and think through them together. So this is the goal, but we have a lot of work to do before we get there. First, we need to think about the ways in which translation itself has supported the work of empire, and how it is that translation of knowledge has always been in and on the terms of white epistemic, or the epistemic of whichever particular empire has been colonizing indigenous peoples. And so we've drawn upon a theory, several theories of translation especially, that allow us to begin to think through how we can decolonize the translation process in order to bring more people to the table to begin to privilege the epistemic understandings of indigenous people first, and then move into our scholarly understandings after that. But then always with the mind of facilitating language perseverance, even as we're thinking about language preservation, which really does focus on the documentation of languages. And that's actually very important as well. And so when we think about decolonial translation, we go right to the root of the methodology. When you think about the ontological, the axiological, the epistemological, and the delinking processes involved in that. And those are straight out decolonial thoughts. How it is that our lives are interconnected and grounded in positions created by our relationships, as well as how it is that we are all situated within the global modernity. How we work from an ethics of pluriversality to equalize all knowledges coming to the table, to really honor the understandings of peoples and communities alongside language learners, language translators, alongside linguists and scholars doing the work of analyzing these documents to come to an understanding, a socio and cultural understanding. We try to replace these documents then in the collective practice of meaning making, in and through these collaboratives, so that we can begin to make knowledge where we are. Because where we are is where we think. We are where we think. Very important understanding of how it is that we relocate knowledge within the understandings of people, pluriversal understandings. But we also have to, all of us, engage deeply in that border thinking. And that border thinking is something that I touched upon in that article. It requires all of us to meet each other where we stand and to begin to deeply understand how it is and deeply engage how it is that we make knowledge together. All of this is to say that the Decolonial Archives then must begin with this understanding that materiality and mediation of knowledge always ask the question, in whose service are we making knowledge? On whose terms are we enunciating knowledge? What counts as knowledge? We must always also pay attention to, following decolonial methodologies, those relationships of knowledge making that we build from the ground up with the people who have a stake in such archives as this, but also in these collective authoring places. And this hope that we can honor and create through our work the pluriversal possibilities that will recuperate suppressed epistemologies, those epistemologies that have been erased in the imperial difference. We think that these three means of creating knowledge will hopefully help us move to indigenize the archives, to relocate them, replace them, and re-relate them to the people who make these knowledges. There are four big implications here that we're after. We're trying to create these decolonial possibilities for recuperating these ideas, words, practices, and understandings together. We're also trying to provide for the collective learning and scholarly production possibilities so that more people can work with community in doing the work that we hope applied linguists would aspire to do. We also think through the Decolonial Archive building for language preservation, that documentation process that's so very important for us to build as much as possible the knowledge base that we have about our languages. But more equally important is the language perseverance efforts, how we can create the practices of reading, writing, speaking, and listening through these textual translations. And by text, we mean to write that very largely. Right now, we are working with handwritten text and Cherokee, but we imagine multiple media to be able to be brought to bear here. Finally, we'd like to center the work of dissemination and contextualization of historical documents as part of that vital work of language teaching and learning. And that's mostly what I'd like to talk with you about today. That is that practice of translanguaging, of crossing borders together and of decolonizing knowledge together. Thank you so much. And with that, I will stop sharing.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. In order to begin the conversation, I've got a couple of questions that I would like to raise with you, and perhaps you can help me and other people think through this. The first one is a very general one. I understand, for example, the problems that, let's say, non-Indigenous researchers may confront when they are trying to carry out research in Indigenous communities. Let's say one is non-Cherokee, but they're trying to carry out research amongst the Cherokee, in the Cherokee Nation. That I can understand. But what I would like to get from you, because of your unique role and status as both a linguist, scholar in literacy, and a member of the Cherokee Nation, what are the challenges of carrying out research amongst the Cherokee Nation or amongst the Cherokee people when you are one of them?
It's a really wonderful question, and thank you so much for that. Because it's this unique process of being a border thinker, even within my own nation, as I'm doing this work. And so it's this constant crossing of these, of what have been the traditional divides between disciplinary understandings and community-based understandings. And so that's one border that I am constantly negotiating and trying to make sense of and trying to work through. There are many other borders. There's quite a bit of, and Cherokee Nation is not unlike other nations in this regard. We have quite a bit of identity politics. And so it matters a great deal, that it matters to some people a great deal, that though I'm a Cherokee citizen, I'm also privileged with white skin. And so I don't know the oppression that other individuals who have brown skin or who are phenotypically stronger Cherokee might have faced. And so they therefore might question the authority or ethos by which I've come to this work. That is a very rare read. Not many people have had that. But then again, my skin is white. Were my skin black, would they have greater questions? I think maybe yes, perhaps. So that's another border. Another border has to do with the ways in which the stance of authority really has everything to do with how we build our relations and how we continue those relations. And that's been extraordinarily difficult with the current pandemic, and very, very hard. It's not the same to have these distant mediations. They're helpful in some respects, but in other respects, they need to be complemented with face-to-face and complemented with interactions that are, much simpler and less complicated and deep and complex as these. A final border is that sometimes people will value one kind of languaging art over others at particular times, depending on the exigence. And so helping individuals understand that all four can work in conjunction, that reading, writing, speaking, and listening really need to work together to help people build language perseverance, and help people build both the meta-linguistic knowledge that you and Suresh have also spoken to, but also the ways in which it allows everyone to become a border thinker in that regard. So it's such a wonderful question, and I hope I've gathered or presented just a little bit of the complexity of the moment.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, thank you. And let me just continue with the conversation so that later on we can open it up to everybody. When you are talking about language perseverance or language preservation, this is different from language reclamation, is it not? Or language perseverance and language preservation for you are interchangeable with notions of language reclamation?
Oh, that's too is a beautiful question. Perseverance presumes that there is still a legacy of practice.
Okay.
Yeah, and that there is a way in which we can continue to build upon that. Reclamation, I believe, is the very difficult work of thinking about the languages that are no longer practiced.
Okay.
And thinking about how to move those forward. The Cherokee language, the Anishinaabe language, they have practitioners, they have speaker leaders and writers still to this day. And the question for me is, how do we continue to build that knowledge together? Language reclamation, incredibly important work. And it also actually is I think of what's going on with Mayan languages and other languages in countries in China, for example, where languages have been, well, the long and the short of it is that reclamation does its own very important work. The difference is that perseverance, has a contemporary continuity of practice. Thank you for making that distinction.
Okay. And, let me then just ask you the last two questions, then I can stop. In your presentation and then in your writing, there are a couple of things that are not very clear to me. I can understand your argument that we must make pluriversality a general principle, that we must accept pluriversality. But is translingualism seeking to establish a general theory of language or language learning? Because if that is the case, then there is an inherent tension from thinking about pluriversality on the one hand, which allows you to think about multiple worlds, with the idea of translingualism and translanguaging, etc. It appears that you slightly equivocate between arguing for pluriversality on the one hand, which is part of a decolonial approach, and then the issue about translanguaging or translingual practices. Because once you start talking about translingual practices and efforts to level linguistic hierarchies, you seem to be talking, at least at a meta level, you seem to be aspiring towards a general theory, but pluriversality seems to be incompatible with a general theory. Possibly I'm misreading you, but that is the tension that I thought I would like to have a chance of clarifying with you.
I appreciate that comment very much. And I'm curious if you could say more about the incommensurate ability of pluriversality and translingualism. And the understandings of those.
Yeah, I don't want to occupy, to take too much time. What I meant,
no, but this is an important thing for me to get into.
What I meant was that with pluriversality, you are talking about, if I understand it correctly, multiple worlds. Yes, the worlds may be entangled, but there are multiple worlds, and there is no universal principle on which the area of scholarship that you are dealing with or the area of human existence is organized. But then the issue that then comes up with translingualism or translanguaging, because of the nature of the requirements of scholarship, you are forced to define what you understand by translingualism or translanguaging, thereby excluding other possibilities. So the question that is there is whether intellectually you can have pluriversality in translanguaging, or the two are completely different.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And it's a wonderful question because I think it gets at something that has been concerning me lately, and I haven't quite worked this out, but it's been concerning me in terms of other kinds of categories that have been created in modernity, in other ways, other pedagogical and epistemics that or theories that may allow us to do the work of social justice. And the fact that they've been created in contemporary modernity, which has its roots and legacies in the imperial colonial matrices of power, is concerning. To what extent can we actually move beyond that? And it seems to me that translanguaging itself, insofar as it involves those three practices, translation, et cetera, in the article I mentioned those practices, I believe, are methods by which we can begin to engage in the border epistemic, the border thinking, necessary for creating one step toward pluriversality. And so you're right, my work that you're reading in the article is still aspirational. Pluriversality is working from this epistemic, that the epistemic tenant structuring thought that all knowledge is created equal and all languages are equal and they're all equally valuable. And the task we set before us as scholars is to think about ways in which we can enact that in the everyday praxis. And it's therein, Dr. McConey, that I believe we find the possibility of translingualism, both in terms of how it allows us to move backwards as a meta-theoretical perspective on language and forward into very concrete actions that allow us a method to begin to move toward an everyday practice of pluriversality. It is my hope that is the case, but it's a very good question. Thank you for that. And I'm not sure that I have completely well answered it because I have not finished wrestling with that, the crux of the problem that you're working with, that I see you working with, and that is.
This is my last question before I hand over to
please,
Raphael, to allow other people to come in. In your article, if I may quote you, you have the one that we read in preparation for your presentation. There is this statement that says, Marxism, post-colonialism, and critical emancipatory epistemologies that have sought to change paradigms of knowledge making in English studies have fallen short of their liberating mark. Now, I have one question here. Why? Why has Marxism, post-colonialism, and critical emancipatory epistemologies, to some extent, putting it differently, why have they failed? Why have they not accomplished their goals?
That too is a great question. There I draw upon arguments that Walter McNullo has made in thinking about the enunciation of knowledge. and the locus of enunciation of knowledge. And Mignolo describes the ways in which Marxism and post-colonialism has really been thought of within as a response to an alternative to, an alternative within Western modernity, but it hasn't really restructured the tenets of Western thought. And so without restructuring those tenets that undergird Western thought, the axiological, the ontological, and the like, without restructuring those tenets, we cannot begin to realize the decolonial possibilities of pluriversality. If anybody would be interested in an article on that, I'd be happy to share. He's made a very compelling argument in that way. I will also add that when Mignolo did most of his work, he was drawing upon the thinking of Latin American, Middle American, and Indigenous American peoples as the locus of enunciation. And so he was able to recuperate an understanding of earth and place and land. It's not a complete theory, and it's not, it has its problems and it has its limitations. I won't go into that here, but I will say that in terms of its critique of Marxism, and if I may say also that I was a critical scholar when I first graduated from my PhD, and my first book was really deeply into critical pedagogy and critical scholarship. And I found it wanting because it could never really help me understand what was happening in communities, or never really value what was happening in communities, or see that as knowledge or learning. And so in the struggle and the tools, my first book, I really continued to bump up against the limitations of critical theory, because it didn't allow me to show all of the knowledge and the workings in this community. And so I eventually abandoned that and pointed out the limitations of critical theory in 1999 article in Research and the Teaching of English, where I proposed the limitations of that thinking. So it's
right.
Yeah. I hope I have explained why.
You have. My role is simply to ask. Raphael, I can hand over to you. I'll then come back later on to sum up. Yeah.
Thank you, Makoni, for initiating the discussion. Just so I give an overview of people and questions that are to be asked. There are 5 people who have written to me. They want to ask questions. That's Teboho Motaboli, Magda, Sangeeta Bhagagupta, Xiaoyo Yu, and Ananda Finna. And if you have asked a question in the chat box, in the interest of time, I will read the question. Otherwise, I will give you the floor. So the first question, Professor Cushman, is from Teboho Motaboli. And the question is, can the professor speak to the future of decolonial theory in 20 to 50 years on? Will it be different from post-colonial, neo-colonial, and such epithets of the past?
That's a very good question. I believe, or I'm hopeful at least, I remain cautiously optimistic, that the groundswell of individuals interested in systemic change, deeply systemic change, are beginning to think about the ways in which knowledge and words and categories have impacted all of us and made us all less human and dehumanized us. And the ways in which those knowledge structures have done that really do point to the imperial legacies that we've inherited in this country and elsewhere. And they point to hierarchies of superiority and inferiority, value systems that truck in that. So my hope is that we're seeing this wonderful confluence of people really trying to think systemically together. And that process will allow us to really think through knowledge forms and understandings and see things with more possibility. In 20 or 30 years, I have dreams for, a society where soil is healthy again and water is clear and the sky is clear again as well. And we stop extractivist thought and seeing humans as expendable, though essential. It's quite ironic. Essential workers are also expendable workers. these are the legacies of modernity, and we face these contemporary problems together. So I remain cautiously optimistic. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. And the second question is from Magda, and she asks, I would like to ask about the image Ellen used on her presentation. It resembles the Inca Jacana cross, which represents the pluriverse. What is the meaning of the cross Ellen used in her PowerPoint?
That's a very wonderful question. May I share my screen one more time? Would anybody be interested in that? A few nods?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, well, just one more time, just so you can see very quickly what that was. Wado, of course, is thank you in Cherokee. This is the Four Winds, and thank you so much for asking about that, because it is an epistemic structure itself, and it guides, but it also represents both the four winds, but the cycle of fire, the central fire around which all life and all people and all of us have a collective whole as fully human beings to protect this earth. And so it's a very powerful symbol, actually, because it is, and it was courtesy of Dan Mink, who is at the Cherokee Nation in the communication. It's a frequently used symbol, but it's also a very ancient one. It was drawn from, and Dan Mink was inspired by the Cahokia Mounds, which were the Mississippian mounds. I'm not sure if folks know about those, but if you're ever able to go visit them, it's one of the oldest sites in the South for indigenous peoples. And some of the pottery there had this particular image on it. But it has very deep meaning for us in terms of organizing ourselves, organizing each other, how we hold ceremonies, how we locate ourselves in this world. When we go to water, we locate ourselves in the middle and then face four directions to find ways to become whole and better people within this world. It is the quintessential Gadua symbol, Gadua people. And the Gatua philosophy, the Gadua civic philosophy, is something that I'm hoping to write a book on next year for a sabbatical, where we get to talk a little bit more about the civic mindedness and the civic participation that creates yeah, stop here. There we go. That creates an understanding of ourselves as working together toward a common good, and we rise up together. And so Gadua also means, quite literally, to rise up. And we rise together through our everyday interactions. So thank you so much for that wonderful question. It is a really powerful epistemic, cosmological, everyday action, civic kind of understanding.
Thank you. And the next who would like to raise an issue is Sangeeta Bhagagupta, who would like to raise the issue of different languaging modalities. Sangeeta?
Yeah, thank you for this. So I want to touch upon two tensions, and I think Sinfree has raised them. So one could frame it in those. The first is the pluriversality and universality issue. And the other is the processes of border thinking that you are raising. So if you look at signed languages, or what is called the deaf community, which is a problematic positionality in itself, because hearing people use signed languages. So I, as a hearer, speaker, when I do field work or when I am meeting with deaf individuals and I'm signing, then I am a deaf person, even though audiologically I hear. So my point is to ask about this border thinking in terms of the epistemic issues you are raising. So how is reading, writing, speaking, and listening all needed? What about the embodiment of languaging? how do you see this issue coming within a pluriversality tension? So how is translanguaging or translingualism a lens to allow us to go forward?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And I hear an important point in your question as well, and I want to honor that, and that is the embodiment of language and the ways in which the embodiment of language and the mediation of language as a representation of self, as a placing of a person is absolutely crucial. And very truly and honestly, ASL brings that forward to us. In powerful ways, very powerful ways. And it does so by allowing us to understand quite truly the physicality of language, something that I think that we've come too far away from. When we think about the pronunciation systems, for example, there's a different way of breathing in Cherokee. If you want to aspirate an H, you're going to have to think about holding your mouth differently. You're going to have to think about your exhale of breath differently, how it is that you must slow down the practice of production of speech and allow yourself to really begin to understand how words are formed through breath and through the voice, which is light and energy. And so you can see that I'm beginning to locate the body within the production of language. Reading and writing are similarly material. There's a way in which the hand-eye coordination, the ways in which the scanning, the ways in which the cognitive work of being resourceful and working with language. But your point is so well taken. We've come a little too far away from understanding the embodiment of language. And I believe that ASL helps us do that, which is another reason why it would be even very, very powerful to see how ASL picks up and runs with or expands our thinking on translingualism. Is that your project? Is that your intellectual passion?
No, it is. My point was just that it becomes exotified. So you have tokenism coming in. So people who are deaf then become, and scholars then become the token to help applied linguistics or social linguistics go further. And that is a problem.
It is a problem.
And this is what I read into Sinfri's first issue that he raised about positionality. So where is the borders? What kind of borders are we meeting? And where I think a decolonial lens allows us to get away from this attempt that we all have to make theory universalistic in any case. So.
Right.
So that's just one of the languages that I work with, and that is Swedish Sign Language, not, even though I know some ASL. But the point is still that that body of knowledge has so much to tell us about the silencing and the erasures that have taken place in other areas of social linguistics or applied linguistics.
And it's important, if we're really going to do the work of border thinking, to think through those silences and those tokenizations, and how they become created and in what ways they're created, and how those actually end up dehumanizing us all. And from to my original point, there's a way in which the embodiment and the dismissal of the embodied language of various sign languages and the ways in which people who are translators are merely considered instruments to conveyance of a particular order, a particular understanding in a particular way. It's as opposed to having a mutually sustaining relationship where we learn from sign language as a way of organizing thought and what that means. I think there are powerful potentials for both, for that mutuality that we've not yet tapped into. But the work of exposing the erasure, also part of the decolonial process. It's a 4-part process, really. Relocating ourselves, exposing the ways in which the recuperative work that we need to do, and then thinking through very carefully, methodologically, how we can create a praxis together that is different. And then finally, working together to create that praxis in the everyday and instantiating it. Again, I go back to the 4 winds symbol, and you'll see that that 4-part model of decoloniality is so very crucial. So thank you again for your question.
Thank you. And it seems that the next 2 questions, they touch on similar points. So if I may, I will ask them as a whole. So the first one is from Xiaoyu Yu, and she asks, how has translingualism made a difference in your thinking and specific efforts in language perseverance and preservation? And the next question is from Anna Defina, and she writes, I would like to ask what you concretely mean by translanguaging in your own work, because I am starting to think that different people have a different sense of the construct.
Both are very, very, very helpful questions. So translingualism has allowed me to begin to think through the colonial difference more concretely and more meta-theoretically. It's helped me expose some of the ways in which language hierarchies become experience and everyday interactions. It's helped me even more so in recent work think through how it is we can call people to work together in my own edited collections and the work that I do as an editor, generally speaking, and as a collective. But it's also helped me better conceptualize the back and forth of language learning and the back and forth of the necessary work of moving away from the alphabetic lens, which takes so long. If you're beginning to work with the Cherokee syllabary, it's one of the first moments of epistemic delinking. And it's when you think about translingualism as a place where scripts themselves and the ways in which knowledge and sound are mediated, translingualism is a very powerful leverage at that point. So those are the ways in which translingualism has made a difference for me, especially in the initial work and transitioning from my ethnohistory on the Cherokee syllabary to the work of this Decolonial Archive. It's been particularly important. And then that comes to what I mean by translanguaging. To me, translanguaging is actually a methodology that has quite a bit of potential, but it also has a meta-theoretical construct to it. So it allows you to objectify language and understand it, and as I use it from a decolonial perspective, it allows me to begin to value languages as equally as possible and not replicate the linguistic hierarchies that I see as being perpetuated within the colonial matrix of power. Yes, yeah, I agree with you. It's decoloniality and translanguaging is certainly something that can be read differently. And in fact, in that particular article, you're seeing me try to work out the extent to which translanguaging, as I learned it from your professors, in fact, they're at Penn State, and from other translanguaging scholars and studying their work, it became really apparent to me that my work as an Indigenous person and with decoloniality, that there might be something here that's very helpful for our work. And that article was me thinking through at the most kind of early stages, what that would look like and what work still needs to be done within translanguaging and what work I've tried to take up on myself. I hope I've answered a question. I can tell you generally what I think translanguaging is. Thank you.
And now another set of 2 questions, but these 2 are asked by the same person, Jose Acosta. And he writes, given that we think where we meet, in between quotation marks, if I mentally copied that correctly from your slides, would you be able to speak on the power dynamics and equity checks that manifest in border thinking, given that both the translator and the translated meet in one space that does not belong to at least one of them, the translated? And the second is the idea that modernity can do anything about its tenets. Not sure if I if you were citing Mignolo when speaking of this, though, seems to undermine its very nature, an intentional, visible and invisible coloniality. Would you be able to speak a little more about these?
They're wonderful questions. Thank you so much, Jose. And I am not sure within the minute that I have that I'm going to be able to address these with the depth that they so richly deserve. So let me just speak to the first, and I'm sorry I'm struggling to read my very small chat box even as I look at this. Given that we think where we meet, actually I think I'd like to, we are where we think. We are where we think. And so there's a slightly different sense of that when I think through the epistemological stance that we're taking. And that has everything to do with how it is that we center ourselves and we place ourselves within these relationships. We are where we think. And that gets to your second question, which is the idea that modernity can do anything about its tenets. Not sure if you were citing Mignolo when speaking to this. Yes, I was. Seems to undermine its very nature and intentional, visible and invisible coloniality. Yes, and so when you are where you think, thank you, Jose, I would love to follow up with you. Yes, please. So the idea of modernity itself, generally speaking, the tenets structuring thought are still Western, because the ideas of modernity and critical thinking really grew out of Western epistemics. They didn't necessarily grow out of indigenous or First Peoples or Latin Americans or the people that have been colonized by so many colonizers over and over again. And so there's a different way of understanding our relation to each other and our relation to the translation process that we're trying to instantiate in building this archive, but also in building our work, generally speaking. So you're right, it does undermine. Modernity certainly undermines the very nature and intentionality of making visible and invisible coloniality. I don't think critical theory can question itself the ways in which decoloniality can question all knowledge making. And that's in part because it is done from a particular locus of enunciation. So I agree with you, absolutely, on that. And I'm sorry that I've only had 3 minutes to really talk with you and think through that question, but I hope that's an initial step toward giving you a decent answer that your question so richly deserves. Thank you.
Thank you. And if we have time for one more question before I give the floor back to Makoni. Ashraf, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you so much, Ellen, for the nice presentation. Actually, when you were talking about the notion of indigeneity and Cherokee membership and so on, a question came into my mind, which I can put it in this way. To what extent do you think linguistics has contributed to the construction or the visualization of indigeneity through the very academic discourse itself? In other words, to what extent do you think the discourse which we use to talk about or even to research the conditions or the language situations in those areas have contributed in the construction of indigeneity, a different version of indigeneity? This is and a branch from this question is, you're a Cherokee member and at the same time a professor. To what extent do you think you are, when you say I'm a Cherokee member, you're being fetishized? You know, when I had Sinfree defining you or introducing you as a Cherokee member, you know, the image from the social linguistic books came into my mind. So do you think there's a collateral damage on those members and on those members of the community from the academic research itself? Thank you very much.
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you very much for your questions. Very thoughtful. And so I'd like to speak to your first question, which, if I'm understanding it, really thinks through I'm sorry, I have to be honest with you, I just lost my train of thought. And so if you could please repeat your first question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, do you think the
disciplinarity, yes, I'm sorry, I did remember it, yes. The disciplinarity and how it is that linguists themselves build a discipline, thank you, and translanguaging and all of the disciplinary building that we do. To what extent does it really allow us to be decolonial in our thinking and decolonial in our practice? It's a very interesting question because there's certainly always a way in which the knowledge that we make propels our own institutional positions further and further as it may or may not necessarily be in the service of people and communities. And so when this is difficult because we do have Cherokee linguists, one of whom just passed away, Durbin Phelan, unfortunately. And when his work was viewed by general people in the Cherokee Nation who worked at the Cherokee Nation, many found it too distancing, as in it applied a language, a disciplinarity that distanced them from their language, and they didn't necessarily feel comfortable with it. That being said, his very systematic analysis of the language has also contributed to the understanding of language, but a different kind of understanding in different terms. And so there's a way in which the destructiveness of objectifying the language from that kind of very close linguistic analysis leaves me very unsettled all the time. I very much appreciate the work of linguists and the work that they're doing, especially on my team. It's absolutely indispensable to the building of the language resources that we hope to bring to the community. But I will also say that when it comes to parsing the language as it is, it feels like it's doing a kind of violence to it, to me, to the lived embodiment of that language. And that doesn't feel very good. And so I grapple with that as part of my own border epistemic. When it comes to being tokenized as somebody doing this work, there's a way in which our positions help us do things, and ways in which our positions are always limits. And yes, indeed, I have absolutely felt tokenized on both sides of the coin in lots and lots of situations. I'm not sure that I'm going to ever be able to get out of that situation, frankly, and it's frustrating to me. But then for me, an option as somebody who does a practice of the work that I hope to be doing, decolonial work, it's to see it when it happens, to call people to the floor and say, perhaps you didn't mean to do that, and here's how that impacted me. Here's how I think that impacts you, and let's get this to a better place together. That's the hard work of calling people to the floor. That's the hard work of racial literacy, frankly, that I'm so very glad that people are actually taking up. And it's getting us to think again, looping back to that original question that we had, to think again of the work that we can do together, and why it is that things become tokenized as they do, and why it is that we parse language in the way that we do, and who that serves to parse the language, and then in what circumstances. I don't think we've ever really asked that question. Who is served by that language analysis? Although I will say that decoloniality, there are going to be a couple of books coming out about it. So I'm very eager to see decoloniality and linguistics, in fact. So I'll keep you posted. And you keep me posted, because I'll be interested in seeing that as well. Thank you for your question.
Thanks everyone for asking your questions and helping us to have this very interesting discussion. Makoni, would you like to get the floor back?
Okay. I have a couple of issues that I would like to raise as a way of summarizing the discussion. What I'm going to try and do is to situate this discussion in the bigger context of some of our previous discussions, and hopefully try to project even forward where we are going. The issue that is becoming clearer to me, I talked to Ashraf a bit about this a couple of days ago, is the contradictory role that linguistics seems to play in issues about social justice. There's a slant in linguistics, in language studies, particularly coming from the critical scholars and people interested in language ideology, that frames linguistics as having, to some extent, been embedded in colonialism, reproducing neoliberalism, etc. If that argument is valid, then it becomes very difficult to see how the same discipline can become the source or the springboard from which you can try and initiate and accomplish issues about social justice. The same discipline can be colonialist, reproducing neoliberalism, and at the same time, one that can facilitate social justice. There are these two tensions which are to some extent partially irreconcilable. Then the second thing that is there, I think, second issue which is there, which is interesting about all this discussion, is it consists of where are we at this particular point in time in terms of discussions about decoloniality. It's quite clear that there is a lot of interest which is developing around topics of decoloniality, whether it's decoloniality of linguistics, sociolinguistics, applied linguistics, history, political science, etc. Things are just sort of blossoming. But having said that, it is important to see that there are a number of different strands to this. You can have the Latin American work that is influenced by Mignolo, etc. But you also have some very interesting work that comes from a cross-fertilization of ideas. So, for example, you can have the work by Fanon being used to carry out a decolonial sociolinguistic analysis. You can have the work by Sadra Hedding being used to talk about post-colonialism, decoloniality, and radical feminism. That sort of cross-fertilization of ideas is very interesting. And then another strand to this decoloniality, which we have not so far been able to bring to the fore, which we have not foregrounded quite a lot, consists of decoloniality, which is emerging in what Mignolo calls the post-Soviet analysis, right? So that is another strand that is important for us to keep bearing in mind. Having said that, you still have to deal with the messy nature of decoloniality in the sense that, for example, at least in the African context, not everything was affected or impacted by colonial rule. And colonial rule took place over a very short space of time, about 100 or 150 years at most. So there are a lot of epistemologies that to some extent have survived or out-survived colonial rule, or were in actual fact not impacted at all by colonialism. So the danger of adopting uncritically decoloniality is that you may over-exaggerate the European impact on language and sociological epistemologies on continents such as Africa. Then the other issue that I thought was quite interesting listening to Elaine was that, and this I think touches on what Sangeeta was trying to talk about as well, that from where I stand, I think we need somehow to move beyond thinking of language in terms of a representational system, to thinking of languages in terms of communicational technologies, etc. Why? This is because the notion of representation in decoloniality is, as McDonald would put it, it's a very toxic word, right? So I try, whatever I can, try to avoid that notion of language as representation, precisely because of the idea of representation, which is very toxic. The final thing which is there, which leads me to, which continues with my current way of thinking, is that I'm interested in seeing what these alternative epistemologies, which are encouraged through a decolonial imagination or pluriversality, would look like. What would our applied linguistics look like if we thought language had more in common with a headache, for example, with a smell, etc.? What exactly would it look like? What it would do is you then couldn't collect linguistic data, because you can't collect headaches, you can't collect smells, for example. You experience them. So in other words, if you start thinking of language in terms of other newer categories, you then realize that it is very difficult to think of language outside human experience, right? And that's sort of generally where my thinking is at the moment, that I'm interested in seeing what are the other ways in which we can think about it, and what are the implications for our practices. Now, what we're going to do now is that Ashraf and Christine are going to come in and to talk briefly about a project that they are engaged in before we move on to what is called the after hours party. Ashraf or Christine, who is going to be taking the lead?
Yes, I just need to share the screen. For some reason, I don't know why the PowerPoint is not coming out.
I think somebody has to give you permission to be host.
Has already been made a co-host.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry if the word share itself disappeared completely, the word share.
Okay.
Ashraf, I can try to share my screen here.
Yes, please.
Yes? Okay, let's
Yes,
see.
please.
Oh, okay, yes.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you for the space. First, because it's the offline space and it's still online space. It's just an invitation. It's a call for chapters or for papers for a book project, which is called The Social Linguistics of Protesting. It's basically the basic idea of this project. Can you go to the second slide? Yes, the basic idea is that, we are witnessing different protests, different demonstrations, different dynamics around the world, ranging from, as we've seen in the first slide, ranging from Black Lives Matters movements to revolution dynamics in the Arab world, different kinds of protesting. So the basic idea of this project is that those, actually this is the theoretical epistemological basis of the whole project, is that those protesting discourses and practices actually have to be described or defined or studied or searched from within the scarcity and historical conditions, or their historical and scarce conditions. We need to describe and study them on their own terms, not in the terms of other set of meta-languages. So this is the basic idea of the project. Can you go to the second slide, please? Yes, the main issues or themes for this book project is that, these are the main themes: the testing and the meta languages, and more, or the naming practices, how those protests or even resistance movements are described in their own terms, on their own terms, using their own discourses. Also, another issue is racism and protesting movements. And a third issue, which is relevant to this presentation is anti-colonial protesting discourses, and also gender and protesting movements, and also how protesting itself is being landscaped. And this is the issue of linguistic landscaping and protesting, and also protests and the body, how they're embodied, tattoos and so on, and also translanguaging and protesting. Actually, we've tried to bring different issues and themes, whether theoretical or empirical, but bring them together. Also, protesting and art performance, translation and protesting discourses, and so on. So these are racial ideologies and protesting and so on. So any theme which you think is related to the issue of protesting, or if you think you have a different issue which is not listed in this list, which can focus on the issue of protesting, please send it to us. Yes, these are the deadlines. Send us just an email to express interest in and a tentative title, and also that's maybe next week. And also we need an abstract submission. If you can send us an abstract with an interest, that would be great, because it can help us in the construction of the proposal. And the complete chapters on the 3rd of April, that's in 6 months time. And the book, actually, the publication of the book is envisioned by September 2021. That's the whole idea of the project. Thank you so much. So, Christine, if you want to say something.
Thanks, Ashraf. I just like to reinforce the invitation for our colleagues to engage in this project. And that's it, yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Makoni, for the opportunity to share the proposal.
Yeah. Feel free, if you want to say something, you can come in. Thank you.
Right. Then back to Magda.
Okay, so that will end our formal part of the forum. So I will stop recording.
Okay.